Assalamu alaikum and welcome to In Conversation with me, FERMIDA Kassem. Amid the concern of the pandemic, humanity is also faced with temperatures that are rising each year with disastrous consequences. Experts have raised concern with a 1 degree Celsius increase in planetary temperature since the start of the Industrial Revolution. Everything is changing fast, and we are seeing an increase in extreme weather changes, in droughts, floods, wildfires, cyclones, tornadoes, and heat waves. Joining us to help understand the urgency of the climate change crisis is Climate Justice Charter Movement activist Awande Buthelezi. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Awande, you have been involved in various projects, including the Climate Justice Charter. Please share with us more about yourself and about the Charter.
Hi, I am an activist for the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign and a researcher and organizer with the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center, COPAC, which is one of the constituents and founding organizations or grassroots groups that have helped form the Climate Justice Charter. The Climate Justice Charter comes out of 6 years of activism on food sovereignty. It was born out of when the drought was at its highest back in 2014, the drought which we've been in consistently, but at its peak. The South African Food Sovereignty Campaign was formed out of grassroots engagements around questions of water stress and food sovereignty. And then the Climate Justice Charter itself, coming out of these 6 years of activism, was first inaugurated in November 2019 at a climate conference where the first draft of the charter was consolidated. And then on June 16, 2020, there was a final round of public input. And then on the 16th of October 2020, this Climate Justice Charter movement held an online Climate Justice Assembly with Parliament as part of World Food Day. And then we had various members of Parliament there to debate their vision on climate. And then we had inputs from youth activists, climate scientists, and the constituency groups who had helped give input into the charter. And we handed over a climate science document, the Climate Justice Charter itself, and a memorandum to the Deputy Speaker of the South African Parliament. The Climate Justice Charter itself is a document that is based on 6 goals. It has 8 principles, and there are 14 systemic alternatives that are presented in the Charter. So the Charter itself is a grassroots, people-made initiative that helps. It's grounded in the science of climate change, but it helps provide a or multi-vision perspective on what our society can look like if we seriously tackle this issue of climate change, if we seriously come to terms with what it means. And it provides different ways in which we can envision a more just and more equal South African society that tackles the issue of climate change head on.
The Charter identified that the Southern African region as a climate change hotspot, making it more vulnerable to climate change compared to other parts of the world. Why is that?
The Southern African region is a more vulnerable to climate change as a hotspot because what it means basically is that it will be exposed to a comparatively stronger effects or comparatively more pronounced aspects of climate change. Southern African interior has warmed at about twice the rate of the global warming over the last 5 decades. And climate models suggest that this pattern of above average regional warming will continue for the rest of the century. That's what it means to be a hotspot. And that's what it means in terms of our intensity of the pronounced effects of climate change being more. Second, it also lacks coping capacity. So Southern Africa is made up of developing countries which do not have the sophisticated disaster management systems and infrastructure of the global north. We don't have the money to spend on climate adaptation, or comparatively, we don't have as much money to spend on climate adaptation. And our economics are very sensitive to the changes in climate. So if there's a hit in the agricultural systems, if the tourist industry takes a knock, we will feel it. Thirdly, Southern Africa is dry and a warmer region that is not only projected to become, it's only projected, sorry, to become drastically warmer if this is not reined in, but also drier. So when a dry and a warm region becomes even drier and the warmer, the options for climate change adaptations become more limited. So when we put this into perspective, the UN IPCC reports of 1.5 degrees heating that was released in 2018, which projected some of the most recent figures along which we speak about in terms of at what rate or pace that the planet is warming, according to, if we see a 1 degree Celsius heating as we already have, that means an increased 2% in regions such as this, compared to other parts of the planet where it would probably be along the lines of that 1 degree Celsius heating.
Okay, we're going to take a short break now, and when we return, we're going to look at the climate change effects we can experience in South Africa. Welcome back, and thank you for joining us. In studio with me to help us understand the urgency of the climate change crisis is Climate Justice Charter movement activist Awande Buthelezi. Awande, we spoke about the Southern African region as a climate change hotspot. What extreme weather impacts can South Africa expect?
Well, as I was saying, we can put into context in that with a 3 degrees Celsius heating of global warming, so if it's not reined in at the 2 degrees level, or if we go beyond what we're trying to stop it at the global level, there'll be an increase in multi-year droughts. We're already feeling some of those impacts right now, the drought being probably the most pronounced or the most clear indication of a changing climate. So we would have multi-year droughts, heat waves that last longer and more often than we're used to, much more severe. This may contribute both to, the collapse of both the maize and cattle industry in large parts of Southern Africa. So that would be a big dent to the agricultural sector. And although Southern Africa is likely to become a more drier area under, future climate change, it's also possible that the extreme rainfall events will occur more frequently across the region. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is that despite it being drier and hotter, we would see more flooding in certain parts of this region.
And experts are stressing the need for urgent change in the next 10 years. Why the next 10 years, and what can we expect?
Well, that's a great question, actually, which brings me back to what I was saying in when you asked about climate hotspots, in that the 2018 International Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC Special Report on 1.5 degrees Celsius heating, is a now kind of famous report that was released by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the kind of premier panel or grouping of scientists and experts from around the world who work on this issue. And the main findings of that report were that we've already gone past 1 degrees heating, and that we have 10 years, well, 9 years now, but at the time it was 12, to stop the global heating at 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the Paris Climate Agreement, which is also probably the most well-known global geopolitical focus with regards to stopping climate change, it broadly agrees on the ceiling being 2 degrees. So 2 degrees started becoming, or more commonly understood as, where we should rein in this level of heating of 2 degrees Celsius. But this IPCC report then states that, well, even at 2 degrees, we would not necessarily be averting some of the worst effects of what climate change has to bring, and that's to remain in a safe zone as we are right now, or in a zone that is relatively stable for society and across the world. We would have to rein it in at 1.5 degrees Celsius, which basically says that places such as ours, hotspots in the global south, we needed to be at that zone, and we only have these 9 years for our emissions to be reduced to a level in which we can make that 1.5 target. And basically also what it means is that, or what the final finding was, that what you need is a rapid, far-reaching change in the way in which society is organized. That is what the IPCC reports is basically stating. That's what those 10 or 9 years mean, is that we need to really shift the way in which we organize and manage and run and function as a society.
And how do we participate in this shift? What do we do as society?
Well, now this brings me back to the Climate Justice Charter, which is, it's in the name itself, but the focus is climate justice. So climate change rather, and how it's been approached, has been mainly understood and conceived of or spoken of purely along the lines of the physics and the science of it, and to a degree sometimes the economics of it, with regards to the shift in energy from fossil fuels to renewable energy. But the term and the concept of climate justice is one which doesn't just see climate change as purely being an environmental or a physical or a physics issue, but puts it within the framework of it being a political and an ethical concern also. And I think for us as normal citizens that we need to start carrying and thinking in that framework, and that climate justice is social justice. So climate justice affects the most disadvantaged. It also affects countries such as ours, which are trying to bridge a historical gap in development. So we need to start thinking of climate justice in the same way in which we think about inequality and racial justice in those terms. And that's the way in which we can enter that space of, as normal citizens, of understanding how do we plug in. So that also informs the way in which we approach the role that our country and our government should be taking in addressing this issue, in the same way that we may be seeing or needing our government to take serious concerns of social justice and inequality that has occurred as a legacy of apartheid and colonialism. Climate justice, or rather climate change, is also situated within that context.
So what you're basically saying, that the climate justice concern must be a serious concern that we must look at in our everyday lives. But now, since we've been faced with the lockdowns globally, has there been any identification or notice of movement reducing in some way?
Well, I think that the issue of the lockdown and the COVID pandemic has done two things. On one front, there has been a concern that it may have distracted or taken away understanding and momentum that has been building around issues concerning climate. But on the other hand, it's also served as a kind of dress rehearsal for the levels of focus and the degree to which such crises, which will become more frequent as the world starts to heat up. I mean, pandemics are also something which are included in the kinds of society disruptive kind of processes or issues that we can expect in the heating world. It's kind of prepared us and put us in the framework of what it means to, at a societal level, address these kind of disasters. So I'm taking the optimistic route with regards to saying that I think this moment has made us more alive to what it means to address these things and as a unified front, and in a way in which is equitable for all members of our society.
We're going to take a short break, and when we return, we'll look more at the impact of climate change. And thank you for joining us in studio with me to help us understand the urgency of the climate change crisis is Climate Justice Charter movement activist Awande Buthelezi. We often hear that the continued use of coal to power our economy and society is not making our world a better place. Instead, it has worsened. How will you and your team of climate experts aim to ensure that government and Eskom speed up its efforts to meet the global climate agreements?
Well, the Climate Justice Charter is a grassroots social vision or effort to socially and economically restructure society. And the continued use of coal by our state it's entrenched in the history and the long legacy of cheap electricity, which is rooted in the colonial project, and the way in which Eskom itself has been structured, and the way in which the resources and minerals of this country have been extracted for its purposes. But at the same time, what we're calling for is, if you follow the latest trends, the data, what's possible right now, in that there are other alternatives in the way in which we can, generate and provide energy that go beyond this reliance on coal as our country has been reliant on for over a century now. And solar energy, for example, I mean, there are a multitude of alternatives, which the Climate Justice Charter also states, but are also generally known. But if I could just focus on one such as solar, for example, has become far cheaper and also has a higher potential, or some of the highest potential in the world, in a country such as ours. And it also has a democratizing potential. So industry organizations, such as Eskom, which have centralized their functioning and work as these kind of large behemoths where everything happens and is filtered through that organization with regards to the generation and transmission of electricity. If you were to transition to something like solar, it has other democratizing effects with regards to how solar infrastructure is structured and spread. You could have solar stations in communities, on people's houses, and the way in which that energy would be generated and the way in which it could be owned also could give communities and historically disadvantaged groups economic access in being able to generate and sell what's called, again, that source of power. So removing ourselves from the dominance and dependence on coal moves just beyond the question of energy generation in and of itself, but also in the way in which our country, it looks to which a different way in which our country itself can be organized, and a way in which we can bridge those kind of divides and close the inequality gaps.
You mentioned just about solar. What are the other alternatives in terms of producing electricity that South Africa can actually look at?
So beyond solar, another great alternative that South Africa could look at is wind energy, particularly along the coast, the Cape, around the Cape. I think that in terms of our solar and wind potential, even offshore wind energy, South Africa as a geographical structure extends far beyond just the land. But if we go further south into the ocean, there's a large part of that which is actually part of this country where there are high winds. We're actually quite blessed in that regard, in that we have those forms of energy available to us. And then there's also obviously hydropower or offshore hydropower, which would take a bit more development with regards to technological input, but it also provides an opportunity to help skill, create innovation and jobs.
Okay, so my major question here is the government moving fast enough? And you mentioned about the wind turbines. Do you know of any of those, if they're actually hitting off the ground and they're getting started in the country?
The South African government has been very slow and relaxed when it comes to addressing the question of climate change. South Africa is the 14th largest emitter in the world and the #1 on the African continent. We see ourselves, we are a developing country, and I think because of that, we do see our responsibility and our need for urgency as being diminished due to the fact that we are in that position in the global pecking order. But comparatively, South Africa does a lot more than other developing countries when it comes to our rates of pollution and our rates of emission. So we also have a lot more that is required of us. And because of that, there's also been very slow movement on these alternatives and with regards to energy. But what we've seen is actually a greater investment in fossil fuels. We are still looking to build some of the two of the world's largest coal-fired power stations in Medupi and Kusile, which haven't been finished for over a decade now. And we are looking at investments in offshore oil currently. So the South African government is actually moving backwards on this question than making any sort of meaningful progress.
That's actually very sad to hear. In terms of the Justice Charter movement, are you going to take the matter now to Parliament? What's the process next?
We have handed over the Climate Justice Charter to the Deputy Speaker of Parliament. We've asked that Parliament have 1 year to take a look, debate it, consider it, understand what is being offered and the ways in which South African citizens can be given an opportunity to actually have a democratic say in how we transition into a more sustainable and equitable society. And we are hoping that come the 16th of October this year, once that 1 year process has been done, that the government would have actually taken a serious consideration of what is being offered to them by members of their society from the grassroots, all the different groups who've given input into this. We're hoping that when we meet again on the 16th of October, we can have something positive to say about where we can move as a country.
Okay, we're going to take a short break now, and when we return, we'll look at the role that we need to play during the climate change. Welcome back, and thank you for joining us in studio with me to help us understand the urgency of the climate change crisis is Climate Justice Charter movement activist Awande Buthelezi. Awande, tell me, what are the goals at the moment of the Climate Justice Charter?
Well, the Climate Justice Charter has 6 primary goals with regards to the vision that it's putting forward and what we're trying to achieve in this short window we have of action before this crisis becomes something that we can't turn away from. And the first of these goals is advancing awareness that we thrive and coexist on one planet. The second being to inspire a break with the thinking that has caused this crisis in the first place. The third is to reconnect with an earth-centered conception of what it means to be human. The fourth is to deepen cooperation in our society. The fifth is to overcome the crisis of corporate captured leadership, and sixth is to strengthen our democracy.
Awande, tell me, what can humanity do to assist in the push for a good change in the climate now and in the next 10 years?
The focus of what humanity can do and what we as citizens and our governments can do is a focus on climate justice, as I was stating earlier. Climate change has often, or the response to climate change has often been framed as an individual action. Not to say that there isn't a place for individuals to act, but it's a very limited part of what the true story is with regards to why we are in this situation. And that what we need is collective action. And we need those who are responsible at the top and those who are most responsible for contributing to this crisis to give their equal share of actually addressing the issue. And that occurs on multiple levels. At the global level, that means that countries who have a historical debt with regards to their impact and their emissions, such as developed countries. And to bring it down to the national and local level, it means companies, organizations, and industries that have had a historical impact on being responsible for their own share of emissions also need to play their part. So as citizens, I think it's just incumbent on us to educate ourselves and be more aware of the players in our society who play that role, of that function of having that historical kind of debt, and for us is to be active citizens in applying that pressure to want more from our officials with regards to them being more energized in addressing this issue.
So basically, we need to actually push for government to address the climate charter justice movement, the whole document. So we need to push for them to address it sooner than later. Is that what you're basically saying?
Yes, and to also just to take part and avail ourselves to initiatives such as the Climate Justice Charter, which is a grassroots effort, to just sign a petition such as the one that's being put forward by the Climate Justice Charter, and to read and just involve ourselves in these processes that are being led by citizens such as ourselves, not to wait for the state to hand down an edict or grand plan on how they're going to address it. We should just actively take part in initiatives such as the Climate Justice Charter with regards to how we want to see our country transition into a sustainable society.
You mentioned earlier that South Africa is on top of the emitter list in Southern Africa. So why are we on this top, and what are we doing wrong compared to the rest of Southern Africa?
Our position is also as a result of our legacy, our colonial history and our colonial legacy. We have been abundantly blessed, so to speak, with coal as a fuel, and it was a central part of the colonial economic architecture to have this cheap electricity source, specifically during the period when the mining was booming, or the mining industry was beginning to boom in our country. And since that construction, or since that foundation, we have not moved away from the source of energy, because it's been beneficial to us to have this kind of cheap energy source. So it's basically just as a legacy of our colonial societal and economic structure. The real failing is that since 94, we have not been forward thinking in our ability to move away from this and to envision a new way in which we generate electricity for our society. So
let's say we move away from coal. Will this affect jobs in the future?
That's a great question, which brings us to the topic of a just transition, or a deep just transition, as we'd like to call it. Which a deep just transition, or a just transition, basically speaks to the fact that those who've had the least to do with regards to putting us in this situation of crisis of climate change should be the ones who are put forward and thought of first in transitioning away from our current mode of life. They should not be the ones who have to pay for that transition. So when we transition away from certain industries and ways of managing our economy, such as mining or the extractive industries and the production of electricity through coal, we should put those workers first. And that's what a just transition, which the Charter also calls for, are putting forward, that these are the people, and also communities, who have been affected by mining pollution and things such as that, need to be put forward. This is the focus of the kind of structure in which we should be approaching this question.
I've always looked at solar, and I actually thought that it seemed quite expensive to put solar in the home. But you said it's actually much more cheaper. How is that when the service providers are actually charging a lot of money to do it?
Well, the actual production of electricity from solar, it was called again per kilowatt, the price has reduced. We do have barriers in this country and or in the global south, being infrastructural, the technological barriers that more infrastructural and with regards to knowledge. But that requires a government investment or economic investment in our economy transitioning towards focusing on making sure that those barriers are mitigated, because once that initial cost of infrastructure has been covered, then moving forward, the production of electricity through solar will be much cheaper for us.
And do you think if we as South Africa move in our residential premises and in businesses, if we move towards solar, there's going to be a fee that we still have to pay the government?
Well, it depends how the state would like to structure that kind of transition. And in the Climate Justice Charter, what we're calling for is there's a way in which this can go, in which we as citizens pay more for it, or are in a sense punished for that transition. But there's also a way in which it can also produce a more regenerative or society building transition into such sources of energy and such sources of approaching this mitigation of emissions in our country. So one, for example, is the question of socially owned renewables, which I briefly brought up, is a way in which you can look towards structuring that kind of transition in, maybe putting that infrastructure in historically disadvantaged communities, helping to build up those areas through that kind of infrastructure, and giving them an equitable share in ownership of the money that will be generated from the sale or transmission of that energy. But beyond just the provision of things such as solar, another way in which emissions should be reduced, which also help to limit or close the gaps, the inequality gaps in our country, is through the provision of effective, safe public transportation. That's another way in which is often overlooked, but is also a very necessary intervention in reducing these emissions. It's just to provide something such as proper public transportation.
Awande, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to come now to the end of our discussion. But before we close off, you mentioned that there's a petition, a place where South Africans can go and other viewers can go from around the world. Do you want to give us the website where viewers can actually click on?
The South African Food Sovereignty Campaign's website, which is asafsc.org.za, has the Climate Justice Charter tab there with a link for the actual charter, the climate science pamphlet, and a link to the petition, which is on amandla.mobi. So if you go on amandla.mobi and search for the Climate Justice Charter, you can sign the petition to endorse as an individual, and you can also sign the petition there to endorse as an organization.
Well, that's all the details now that we have about the Climate Change Justice Charter. Do join us next week for In Conversation with me, FERMIDA Kassem.